Welcome back to another episode of The Loco Fit Show, where we redefine what healthy means to you. I'm your host, Lauren Conlon, and this week I'm joined by Rick, our mental health counselor, and we are going to talk about, a few different topics. When to start therapy, when to stop, and then maybe how to integrate coming back. We've been getting some questions about this, and I think that there's a lot of people just in general who maybe listen to the podcast, well, is therapy right for me? Or just in general, it's becoming a lot more common, and they're just wondering, okay, maybe when do I start? When would I stop? And I know we touched on this in a podcast, I think one of our very first ones a long time ago. So it was definitely time to do a reboot and also talk about some other questions there. So when to start therapy, what would be some of the things that a client may be experiencing to where you would recommend that they start?
Sure. Pain.
Okay. Words. Hard-hitting topics.
No.
Pain,
therapy is
regret,
not
suffering.
Therapy isn't a new concept by any means, and it's something that's gotten a ton of publicity over the last 5-10 years. It's really grown in popularity. There's a lot of different mediums and avenues for people to start to seek it out. And so I think everybody kind of has a general idea of what it is. When you're ready to start therapy is when you're ready to confront some of the things that have been happening. Like if you want help in dealing with aspects of a relationship, if you're feeling depressed, if you're feeling anxious, if you're having difficulty at work, if you've noticed that you have a tendency to do certain things or patterns have emerged in your life. You keep ending a relationship after 3 or 4 months of dating somebody and you can't figure out why, long-term relationships aren't there. Or maybe you have some trust issues that have developed or a fear of abandonment, and every time you kind of recognize the same thoughts, the same feelings, the same patterns, redeveloping, reemerging, but different people, different situations. And so when to start therapy is really an individual process. There will be other people in your life, and I encourage you to kind of listen to that sometimes. If everybody's saying hey, have you considered talking to somebody about this? If your husband or wife is saying that to you, if your mom or your dad is saying that to you, one of the things that we really want to pay attention to is the people in our lives, are they asking us to get help with something? Because sometimes they're the ones that care about us and we might not want to hear that message or receive it. But they usually are the ones that do care about us the most. And so especially if it's coming from multiple sources, it's at least I think people in your life are trying to say that, hey, something isn't right. And so really therapy is just kind of a personal journey. I would never force anyone into it. I've been in that situation and it's not always a bad thing. I mean, I used to work with, felons, people who are incarcerated. And so they're kind of forced into therapy. It's mandatory for them. But what most of them will tell you is that while it starts as a mandatory process, they're really grateful for the process. Once you get going into something and you start something, right? Starting is always the most difficult part. Is once you get going in it, you'll realize that it's not as bad as you thought it was going to be. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit more freeing. So it's really a personal journey. But usually what drives people to therapy is they're experiencing some level of pain. Mm-hmm. And it's that pain that has created enough discomfort in their life to start to say, look, I want to start talking about this or getting help with it.
Would you say that somebody, because, you mentioned, okay, if you have a recurring thought or a recurring behavior, would you say that it is necessary to have figured those things out first before going to therapy? Meaning you might be like, oh, something's kind of off. And then you kind of show up to the session and then it's like, hey, so what's going on? And you're like, I don't really know. And, we've talked about this on the podcast and in general, but you have to be ready. You're only going to share with a therapist what you choose to share, obviously. So you can go in there and be like, well, I don't really know why I'm here. I kind of feel like something's off, but you're not really sure how to answer those questions or, really answer the question of why are you here? So do you think that it's necessary to really have a significant reason? And that reason might change, right? Like you talk about often, people think they're coming to therapy for this, but then really after a few sessions, you realize that it's really about that, right? But do you still think, in your professional opinion, that coming in with some type of a hypothesis, working theory, whatever that is, that this is why I'm here? Or is it, if you're just kind of hey, things are feeling off, maybe I should start to see someone? Do you think that that's even worth that person's time? Or is that going to be just too murky?
I think both theories have validity to it. Some people might feel hey, something is off. I just don't know what. And I'm looking for somebody to explore that with. And oftentimes, the therapists should be trained enough to be able to start to explore even vague topics with people. Mm-hmm. Like if somebody were to come in and be like, I just felt like I needed somebody to talk to. And things have been off in my life. I would start a session by saying, describe what off is and feels like and looks like. You kept mentioning that something didn't feel right in your life. Tell me what right looks like. Tell me what not right looks like. And so it starts to create and paint a picture, right? You start to see the person has to answer those questions. Now, what did I do? Those are open-ended questions, right? I didn't ask yes or no questions. I said, describe to me what, not even a question really, it's a direct statement. Like describe what feeling off looks like. And so the person can start to describe things. And what might they start to describe, right? Some feelings, emotions, which might lead me that, the person's struggling with depression or hopelessness or anxiety. And so it starts to take shape in that direction. Some people are much more intuitive and self-reflective and possess incredible amounts of insight. And they will come to session. You wouldn't even have to ask them to do anything. They'll have like journals, books that they've read that they're recommending to me, and so they're just like, this is what's going on. And sometimes they're looking for a person to see if they've thought of everything. Sometimes they're looking for a sounding board to bounce ideas off of. And sometimes I'm just like, have you considered this or thought of that or done this? And then the person's like, great. And so both have their space. If you're a super intuitive person and like to self-reflect and analyze and go through it, you'll probably really enjoy the therapeutic process. It's probably like more comfortable, so to speak, for you, versus the person who like has never talked to anybody before, doesn't know what it's going to be like. Am I going to be judged, accepted, or not? And so it can be a little bit more frightening for that person to, take the leap forward. I actually think what's beneficial about this podcast is that, and it's funny because I've actually referred it to people who have called and inquired who don't know me, but like people who listen to the podcast get a sense that they already know me. They know my personality. They know my voice, what I find funny, something like that. They know a little bit about me, so they feel comfortable already coming to talk to me, which is a great medium. I've had people where they'll call up and be like, I'm trying to find a therapist. I'm not really sure. And so sometimes I've actually sent them old podcasts and been like, they were calling about trauma. And so I'm like, here, check out this podcast on trauma. Like, see if this aligns with what you think or what you feel. Sometimes I'll do introductory phone calls with people and, spend 15, 20 minutes on the phone with them. They call it a consult call because I believe that you want to have, in order for therapy to be successful, I want you to have a good relationship with that therapist. Like it's important that the therapeutic relationship or therapeutic alliance is what we call it, is probably one of the most single important factors in determining a client's success in therapy and in treatment. And to connect with your therapist, that doesn't mean, they have to think exactly the way that you do. But like, for example, like I know some therapists who will talk about their spirit animal, or like, what are the signs telling you? And, they're just very like soft and won't really push or challenge. And they believe in this. Totally fine.
If that's what you align with, then
that is you as a person. Find that person, right? That isn't me. And so
really? What's your spirit animal, right?
I don't know. The jujitsu choke. That's my spirit animal.
God, you're so lame. Okay. Well, I asked that question because I think a lot of people maybe find themselves in that former part, right? Like maybe something's off, but I'm not really too sure. And I don't really have like a laundry list of reasons as to why. I feel like when somebody like, hey, I got cheated on, I don't know how to navigate that. That is a little bit easier to say, maybe I should go see a therapist, right? Or, I'm finally feeling like I'm really angry all the time, or I'm not handling work as well as I used to. Like maybe I should go see a therapist. But I think a lot of people, at least in my perspective, are in that spot where they're kind of like, I'm feeling like this, but I'm not really sure. And I, at least for myself, I was always like, I'm not going to need a therapist for that because I don't even know what's going on. So how are they going to be able to know? So I think that a lot of times people maybe stop themselves from that or think that they're not prepared enough to go into a session because of that. But to your point, a trained therapist will be able to tease those things out. And it might take some time to find the right person. And honestly, to even find that information out, which is my next question point. What are some realistic expectations? Because I think that a lot of times, especially when people are in a lot of pain, which is typically why they're coming to therapy, they are looking for like the solution, the answer. And they want it right away. We all want everything right away. But when we're working through these things, it's often a lot deeper than like that first level that we really think it is. You know, it's like, hey, this might be why you're here, but there's like 15 other things that are really have gotten you to this spot. So what are some realistic expectations for people in terms of when you start therapy? Like, you're not gonna be able to say, oh, after 3.5 sessions, you'll feel this way. But what are some realistic expectations when starting therapy?
Yeah, I think depending on why you're coming to therapy and what you're working on, set an expectation. Like, if you're coming on a weekly basis because you're struggling with a particular aspect or an aspect of the relationship, right? So, for example, we're talking about an intimate relationship that you have with your partner. And one of the first things we might focus on is communication, okay? Like, I might bring out the 4 horsemen model, and I might start teaching people the underlying aspects of communication. But sometimes the first session or two is really about understanding me learning about you, right? You've been an expert on you for your whole life. I know you for an hour, if that. And so I don't want to rush to judgment on some stuff. I'm trying to get a complete and accurate understanding and a full picture. And I think that's a really important aspect, because sometimes people will come and they're like, I'm paying you, so I expect, results right away. And I'm like, you get that. There's certain things that I have to figure out first. Like, I can't just say, like, fine, if you're looking for 10 tips on how to improve self-esteem, here you go. I don't think you need me for that, though. Yeah,
that's not therapy. That's educating, maybe, or providing resources.
It's psychoeducation, sure. And you can do that.
Not
but and
therapeutic
I think,
process.
And I think so sometimes it's like, this is a process. Am I willing to commit to something like this? And so I liken it to this. I liken it to personal training a lot, right? And I can speak from a firsthand account of this because I actually have a trainer, right? So this is a person that I meet with once a week. Okay. She might lay out workouts and exercises for me, and my 1 hour with that person is great. If I did nothing else other than that 1 hour, Lauren, how much progress am I going to see?
Not a lot.
No. So it's incumbent upon me to take what's done in that session with her and practice it, and to go to the gym and to work out and to do the work, so that my 1 hour with her turns into 5 or 6 hours with myself. And then I come back and we're like, hey, here's this. You can start to correct certain things and adjust and roll. No.
And then what happens with that is that now you can actually make more progress because you've done some things on your own. And that's a really big part of therapy and coaching and training and all of that kind of stuff. The 1 session or the 2 sessions is not going to be, like that 1 or 2 hours is not enough to sustain you for the whole week.
Right.
You have to revisit that. And if we're talking about psychological things, you need to revisit that on probably a daily basis in some type of a reflective way. It might be 10 minutes, but doing that on a more frequent basis on your own is only going to, you can go see a therapist 3 times a week, but if you literally end the session or you walk out that door and you never think about that again, you're not going to make any progress.
Yeah, the person who sees a therapist 3 times a week versus the person who sees a therapist 1 time a week but does the work every day is going to get more out of it than the person sitting with a therapist for 3 hours a week who does none of the work outside of that session. And I think that comes with an inherent idea and understanding of what you're working on, right? So if the problem wasn't created overnight, don't expect an overnight solution. Okay. This isn't the Tony Robbins seminar where he's like, you're capable of everything. Yeah. Like, we're going to go walk over hot coals and like everything can be solved at the drop of a hat. Don't get me wrong. Love Tony Robbins. Use a lot of his work. He's incorporated tons of psychology into what he does. But having a realistic expectation of saying, look, sometimes some of this stuff takes time. It's layered. It's complicated. And if I don't want to rush to judgment, I want to make sure that I have a complete and full understanding of that picture. So here's the other side of this. If you're coming with like a laundry list of things to work on, and I mean, it can be, I've had this. I've had people who are like, I've got these things, and the list might be 10, 15, 20 things that they want to work on. Okay. But they're going to come once a month. Okay. Pick one thing on that list that we can focus on. I don't know. And if that's you, I'm not the therapist for you. I don't know. I don't know anybody who really can do that, but good luck. I can't. I can't look at a list of 10 different things that are various aspects of who you are and be like, okay, I got you for 1 hour this month and I'm going to address this one thing. And within 1 hour, expect to see tangible results.
Yeah.
And so what does it look like? Well, people will say, well, I struggle with anxiety. Does that mean I'm going to get rid of my anxiety? I don't want to be nervous anymore, Rick. I want to be free of that. I don't want to have any more anxiety. Okay, no. You're a human. You're going to have anxiety. You're going to be depressed. You're going to be stressed. The idea isn't to get rid of emotions. The idea is to learn how to manage them, to lessen the intensity, or to give you the tools that when things get hard, you have the ability to manage it successfully without the therapist there. Because I don't live in your life. The idea is to use what you're learning in that session and take it and kind of integrate it within your life.
So yeah, I would say that probably some good realistic expectations to start is the first few sessions might just be the therapist getting to know you. It's kind of like a coach. When you first start working with a coach, you're not going to, I always tell people the starting plan is just that. It's our starting plan. And we may keep that the same for many weeks, just because of the other aspects of coaching, the consistency and just being more on track and all these different types of things. But a lot of times, like, that initial plan is just that we might be changing that. There's nothing wrong with it, right? Like, it's just like we're going to make these minor adjustments, but it takes that period of getting to know someone. I'm not going to say like, oh, I don't know you or your body at all. Here's this new plan. Oh, first week didn't work. Let's completely trash this plan and restart it. That would be terrible coaching practices. So when you go and see a therapist, they're still getting to know aspects of you. And again, based on how much you are sharing, right? You can't expect to withhold certain information and then expect the therapist to be like a mind reader. So going into it with, okay, like the first few sessions might be that person really getting to know me, getting to know the issue, and then actually being open and honest and vulnerable, which is really scary, but you need to be in that place in order to get a lot out of therapy. And then from there, you'll be able to start to make those changes, but also recognize that it's not just the session, it's what you're doing outside of that. How are you shifting your mindset? What reflective practices are you doing outside of your sessions once a week or every 2 weeks?
Right.
And then finally, frequency. And I know this is, again, very vast depending on what the issue is. But generally speaking, is there kind of a trajectory that you would suggest when people are first starting out as just kind of general guidelines? Yeah.
Okay. So let's assume money's not an object right now. Okay. And I know that it is. And so obviously if money's is an issue, you guys, something is certainly better than nothing. I would rather you do something than nothing. So start the process, period. If it's something you see value in, start the process. I'd rather you do one session a month than nothing a month. However, ideally, and this is kind of typical for most people, let's just say we're not dealing with something like super severe, right? But I would usually say it's beneficial to start with weekly therapy sessions. I like to start my clients with let's get into a routine. Let's get into the consistency of talking, exploring, and doing some of this stuff. Now that can vary from client to client depending on what we're dealing with. But I like to start with weekly sessions. And once we get a good handle and understanding of what we're working with, what we're talking about, then I'll like to kick it back to bi-weekly sessions. Now what that does is it says, okay, I have a good understanding of who the client is and a comprehensive understanding of their background, their history, and what the problems are. We've started to create some solutions or some strategies to manage that. And so now what I'm doing by taking it from one session to two, I'm giving you a little bit more time in between sessions to gauge how you're doing with this, right? And so if you're coming back after 2 weeks and we're like, hey, how did it go? Like, oh, well, fine. Things are pretty good. No real issues. None of those old patterns or thoughts or feelings kind of emerged. Like, great. We stay on that path. And for a few sessions, if 2 weeks works for a while, and then if you're having good success, I might say, okay, let's kick it back to once a month. Let's see where it goes. And so we taper it back. Now what's happening is you have 4 weeks in between sessions. And so that's a really good amount of time to see how you're managing yourself. And if things are good, we kind of continue on maybe a once a month basis until it gets to a point where it's like, hey, you're off doing this. You're managing this. I don't know if you really need this on a day-to-day or weekly or bi-weekly or monthly basis anymore. And so that's generally the progression. I like to start with weekly, kick it back to 2, gives you a little bit more time, then drop it back to once a month, and then keep it at that pace until we feel like, yep, you're doing pretty good.
And that's the next segue. Look at me doing a segue. When would you maybe recommend stopping therapy? And again, these are just kind of generalizations. Of course, there's no hard answer here, but what are some signs maybe that somebody is ready to stop therapy? Because generally, while there might be sometimes people are coming in like, hey, I have this one specific issue, like we talked about, it's usually a lot of different things and there's a lot of moving parts. It's rarely like this happened and now I came to therapy for this and it's all of a sudden solved. Like most of our problems are not like that, especially when we're dealing with emotions, and our lives are so dynamic. So what are some signs that maybe it is working and you can go off on your own pretty well?
Yeah. I mean, depending on what the problem is, if you're seeing like, okay, I'm managing my anxiety, I'm using these tools, I'm, doing whatever it is that we've talked about in terms of that strategy, and it's working. And again, you started at weekly, you went to bi-weekly, you're on monthly, and you're managing things. Great. Here's what I want everybody to really understand is the benefit of having a relationship with your therapist is that once you stop therapy, it's okay. Like it's not supposed to be something that's going to last a lifetime for most people. I think people with like more severe problems, like if you're dealing with somebody who has personality disorders, things like that, like therapy might be more of a consistent pattern within their life. But for most of us, it's not going to be. And so you can take a break from therapy. It's good to take a break. I've actually encouraged, some of my clients to do that. I'm like, hey, this is what your intake was. You came in with these problems, right? Or these issues that you wanted to address. And we've worked on them. And now we've reached a point where none of these things exist anymore, or your life has changed in ways that has addressed some of these issues that you originally came with. And sometimes you feel like, therapy just may have stalled in that space. And so I will say to people, I want you to just take some time to yourself and think and see what comes up. And you can always come back. You can always go back and the therapist will pick right up. You'll remember them. They're not going to forget you, and you'll pick right up where you left off. And you can go forward. Sometimes you might feel like, hey, sessions started off really strong and we were doing really great work, but it just kind of feels like I'm checking in. Like, okay, take a break. Say that. It's okay to challenge the therapist too, to be like, hey, I feel like, we've been coming and we've been talking and I feel like it's just gotten to a space where it's like more like a check-in. It's like, okay, that's fine. Like it just either things have progressed with enough time and the ability to kind of process through that, or is there something else that we're really missing in this space, and it can be a lot of reasons. Financial things have come up in their life that have detracted or pulled them away. But by and large, it's normal for therapy to end. You might have been with a therapist for 6 or 7 weeks and been like, okay, like that was good. It was a good start. I'm good. I don't think I need to go back right now. And cool. So you don't come back. People do that all the time. Other times you might be with it more consistently. And then
given
realize
the severity of maybe what's going on. So that's like when to start, when to stop. But then I also wanted to discuss, maybe how to come back or why to come back, right? So you kind of touched on it a little bit, but like, is this a thing to where people maybe have like maintenance sessions? Like, hey, I'm kind of in a good spot, but, maybe every 2 to 3 months, I just kind of check in. Like, is that something that you experience, recommend? Or is that kind of like, no, you're either doing it or you're not?
No, there's people who do that. I have clients who every 2 or 3 months will just schedule a session randomly and, we'll just kind of check in and I'll be like, hey, how are you doing? I'll ask questions. I'll kind of probe. And they like the idea of maintaining the relationship. And
that like sounding board, like you said. Yeah.
It becomes a habit for some people, a healthy habit to say, look, am I keeping this checks and balances with myself? To say, okay, so every 2 or 3 months, it's totally fine. If you don't need it, you don't have to do it. It's not mandatory. And it's always okay to come back under any circumstances, right? If you might have been like, okay, I really addressed this. This is great. Well, life is an evolving concept, right? And so it doesn't just start and stop once therapy ended when you were 35 years old or 42 or whatever it is. You might enter a new relationship or something may have happened in your life and you're like, hey, I would really like somebody to talk about this with. So it's totally okay to come back. I've had clients do that. They were gone for like a year, literally dropped off, didn't say anything, like we're in the middle of therapy and just stopped coming. They didn't schedule any more sessions and they were gone. And then a year later, it's like, hey, Rick, I want to come back. I want to talk about some stuff. And they send an email. We put them on the calendar and then boom, you move forward.
Yeah. And I think that probably like after, why you came to therapy initially, right? You may have, resolved that issue, but now you've developed enough introspection to realize that maybe maybe when things are off. And then you might say, okay, well, maybe now I might not be feeling this other situation anymore because I can handle this. But now I recognize within myself that maybe this is not right. And I still don't know. I'm kind of back to that square one. Like, I know something's off. I don't know what it is, but I have a better sense of something is wrong, but it's not as far down the line, right? Mm-hmm. It's not like, oh, I felt like something's off for 5 years and I can't put a finger on it. Like, this is more like, all right, I've been feeling like this. Maybe this is a sign that I need to go back. Or maybe the things that you were working through before have come up. Or like you said, maybe you did work through an old relationship, but now you're in a new one. Mm-hmm. And there's a new challenge, and because life is very, very dynamic. So hopefully you can use those skills in different areas, but sometimes
I do want to go back a little bit and just talk about the expectations for therapy though, too. I think sometimes people have an expectation that they're going to come to therapy and that they're going to walk out of sessions happy and go lucky and like everything is going to be bright and there's going to be rainbows and sunshine in the sky and they're going to feel amazing and nothing is ever going to be the problem. And sometimes people are going to come in with the expectation that, oh, because I connected this dot, right? That this is like, this level of insight is going to be the key to my existence and it's going to open up the world. And the reality is the changes are going to occur within you, not the world around you. They're going to change by you recognizing what your old habits and patterns are, by recognizing what you're thinking and feeling, how to challenge and dispute those things, and then make changes. And so one of the frustrating things in being a therapist is there's no building that stands when we're done. And what I mean by that is I have a friend who's in construction. And it's an amazing thing because when he goes to work every day, it's a pile of dirt. And then when he leaves work and the project is done, there's this huge tower that's standing. And there's nothing concrete sometimes that we can put our hands on in sessions. There's nothing concrete that we can say like, I built this, I did this. It's just like looking through sometimes the journaling. It's looking through the sessions and the tears and the processing that goes through some of those things. And so I think sometimes people have this expectation that we're going to go to therapy. I'm going to make these insights and my whole world is going to change. The world only changes inside your mind when you're willing to challenge it daily. And so I want you to have a realistic expectation. I want you to challenge your therapist. If you feel like they're not pushing you, tell them. Like I recently had a client who I used to laugh at her because like the first time I recommended she read a book, she was just like, I am not this, like was adamant with me about it. And like 2 weeks later, she's like, that was me. I'm sorry. I just like my initial reaction to it wasn't there, but she kind of came around. And so, but I respected the fact that she was like, this isn't me. And I was like, okay, explain why you think that's not you or what is it that what offended you about that process? And so you like have that kind of conversation, but managing your expectations and sticking with things long enough, to see if there's actual changes that can occur because it's not the therapist that's going to change you. You are going to change you. This person's nothing more than a guide in that process. Mm-hmm. And I'm not an expert on you as a person, and nor do I have to live with the choices and the consequences that you make. Mm-hmm. This is about making your life healthier for you. Mm-hmm. And so really kind of managing that expectation is important.
And I would say lastly, just to tie this up, is there a time where you feel like maybe people can use a therapist as a crutch, like in a negative sense? Like we said, okay, if there's one habit you're going to have, like probably not a bad habit to have a recurring therapy session every month, right? Like probably a healthy habit to have, and probably the best codependent relationship you'll ever have. However, we don't want to joke about that, but people can maybe potentially fall into that trap of thinking like, well, I have to stay here or I can't, like this person is why I'm seeing these results or these changes, right? Like, do you ever see that this happens or is this not really something that ever comes up?
No, I think it can come up from time to time. I think most therapists should be pretty aware if the person's using, but I mean, like, is the person using therapy as a maintenance and a check-in to just kind of keep themselves balanced and create the habit? Fine. There's nothing wrong with that. If they're coming to, every several months and they're just kind of there, like I said, checking in, no big deal. If they're refusing to move forward or they're coming to you just to complain and not make any real progress anymore, right? If they're just kind of using therapy as a space to bitch and whine and not make any real changes, you get very frustrated in that space. And Some therapists will allow that to continue for a really long time because they like the consistency of it, perhaps, and they're not necessarily challenging the client. But yeah, I mean, if therapy is being used as a crutch or, a way for you to refuse to, like, you're coming to the therapy and having conversations with your therapist, but then not going home and dealing with the issues that exist in your life, what's the purpose? Like, get a friend at that point and use that as a tool. It's certainly cheaper, but you don't want to be using it as a crutch to avoid dealing with conflict in your life.
Yeah, and I think that's probably rare, but I would feel that there's probably some people who might do that. So, having a therapist that can be honest with you, and also just, again, you having some reflective practices in place to see, okay, am I just coming in here just to vent? Which sometimes it's going to happen, right? Like sometimes there's just a lot that happened that week and it's like, I just got to get this all off my chest. But if it's on the week after week after week and there's no progress on your end in terms of like what you're willing to challenge yourself on, then it might be, okay, maybe I'm using therapy as a crutch. Because then you could say to yourself, well, I'm going to therapy, so I'm working on it, right? Like, okay, you're going to therapy, but are you really working on it, or are you just going once a week? So, yeah, we wanted to do a little update on this podcast because I feel like, we added some different things here. And I feel like a lot of people can probably find themselves in this space of like, I want to start, but I'm not sure. Am I ready to end this? Do I come back?
Yeah, all those are normal things. I encourage you to talk about those things with your therapist. Therapists sometimes reach the end of their scope with a client and say, look, hey, it's maybe time for you to move on, or you need a specialist in this, or do that. That's okay. Also remember, too, that the therapist themselves is a human being, and they're going to be capable of making mistakes, and they're still trying to figure things out. And so I think sometimes that goes along with managing expectations. If you're, one of my favorite things is people will be like, what do you do? And you're like, oh, I'm a psychotherapist. And they're like, oh, well, you've probably got me figured out. It's like, no, I don't. Like, you're a pretty complicated human being. And after one or two sessions or a conversation with you, it doesn't mean. Yeah,
like you met someone at Starbucks, like, oh, you figured me out. You're like, I'm not a psychic.
Like, no, so I think sometimes when you have a good relationship with your therapist, you can say things like, hey, I want to move in this direction, or I'm not feeling challenged enough, or I'd like more help in this area. And so it can kind of force that person into giving you the work that you're looking for, or maybe it's up to them to be like, hey, maybe it's time for you to find a specialist in this area or do something different. So just remember they're human beings and talk to them like a human being, and you'll be okay.
Yeah. Well, I hope this cleared up some maybe questions or situations that you guys might be dealing with. If you have any other questions for us, you can drop them below in the show notes. There is an anonymous link. We will also provide Rick's contact information, but what is the email?
Full Circle Therapy, FL@gmail.com.
Wow, you said it right this time. Last time he was just like Full Circle Therapy, which was not an email, but all good. So we will put that below in the show notes as well. To be the first to hear about our app, which at this point when we're releasing this podcast, it should hopefully be out. redefinehealthyapp.com. That is where you'll be able to find all the information. And then for all their information about coaching services and the products that we offer, you can visit teamlocofit.com. So thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.